Either ninjas. Oh, look, my phone will let me record in landscape orientation. I guess the other time I had my phone upside down, although I don't know why it matters if it's sideways, which direction sideways is. Anyways, today we're going to be talking about how to dry your own fresh herbs. And this was a question from Beth. She said she's got lots of herbs. She's got oregano and thyme and some other herbs at home, and she didn't know what to do with them. And so there's lots of things that you can do with fresh herbs if you're growing them. So first you can freeze them, but I'll warn you that freezing herbs tends to change the texture and the color. Leaves don't generally like to be frozen. Vegetables in general, when you freeze them, same with fruit, they tend to, the cell walls tend to burst when the moisture in them freezes and expands. It bursts the cell walls, and then when they defrost, they get really soggy. So when you defrost them, they'll have a totally different texture. That's not to say that it's bad. Like, you can totally freeze herbs. In fact, if I ended up with a shit ton of basil, I had like a basil forest one year. Like, I planted a bunch of basil, and then it was just like a crazy summer, and I neglected it, and I came back, and it was seriously, like, I when I cut it all down and laid it in the yard, it covered up like a 20 by 10 foot square foot area. It was a lot of basil. And what I did is I made a lot of pesto, and then I threw some of it in the blender, and then I froze it in like little tiny ice cube trays. You can buy these little ice cube trays at the cubes. They're like 1 inch by 1 inch, so you can just take them out. And while the defrosted basil was not pretty, it still tasted great. So I would throw it in like soup or salad dressing or whatever. But to dry fresh herbs, now there's a couple of caveats. Now, Beth lives in a really humid environment. She lives in Louisville, Kentucky, and in a humid environment, you run into some caveats. So generally, when you want to dry herbs, you would just hang them in a dark, dry, warm space, right? And so what you do is you would like bunch them up and tie them with a string, and then you would hang them from like something like in a garage where they would sit. Julie says, Brat, you are sitting in the sun and we are getting soaked here. Julie's in Seattle. Ha ha. I'm in California, but I'm roasting my ass off, so guess it's a trade-off. I'll trade you or come visit. So anyway, what you do is you would hang them in a bunch, and then you would hang them in a garage, right? So there's a couple of keys that you want to keep in mind when drying herbs. You want to keep them away from light, because light will cause them to break down. You want to keep them away from moisture, because moisture will cause them to mold, and you want to keep them away from heat, because heat will just fry them, right? So like generally, like a cool, dark, like warm garage is a great place. When you're hanging them, you want to make sure you don't bunch them up too much, because the herbs can actually mold where they're all bunched together and the string is tied where they're hanging. You got to make sure they have some air circulation. But if you live in a really humid area, like Beth does, like hanging your herbs might not work, just because, if it's real humid, they might mold, they might not dry as fast. And so there's a couple of options. Now, I know Beth does not have a dehydrator, because she said that in her question. But a dehydrator is a great way to go. I have an Excalibur dehydrator. I love it. It's just got shelves, and you put the herbs in there, and they dry within like an hour. And it's awesome. And they keep the color. They stay nice and bright green. They're really pretty. You can just get like the cheaper round dehydrators that look like a bunch of donuts that are stacked up. Those work just as well. You can get them for cheap at Target or even on eBay. I think I saw one at Goodwill recently for like $8, and it was a really good one. It was like an $80 dehydrator, but I already had one, so I didn't buy it. But if you don't have a dehydrator, there's a couple of other options. If you have no dehydrator and you're in a humid environment, so hanging them to dry won't necessarily work. So one option, if you live in a really dry environment and you don't have a dehydrator and you want to dry fresh herbs, is you can actually hang them in a room that has like a really active air conditioning vent. So like, I know my office, like the air conditioning vent is like super active to the point where like I turn the air conditioner on and close the door, and I have to open my window, because like my room and the bedroom get colder than any other room in the house. And so in order to like create some sort of equilibrium, I need to like open my window a little bit, let some of the cold air out. So if you have a room like that, you can hang your herbs in a really cold room that is sort of kind of nearish your air conditioning vent, and they'll dry really quick, because air conditioners are like dry. Like, I don't know if you've ever like accidentally put a potted plant near an air conditioner vent, but that plant is like burp almost immediately. Again, you want to keep your herbs out of light, because light will cause them to break down. It all causes the volatile oils and flavor compounds to break down, and then they just won't taste or smell very good. But that's one option. Another option, and I know I said earlier to keep them away from heat. This is really important. But if you're very careful, you can use an oven. Now, it's harder to dry herbs in an oven, A, because the heat can fry them, but 2, because if you fry them, or if you dry them in a sheet baking pan, what happens is the herbs like stick to the pan, and then when you pull them off, they're like stuck, and you have to scrape them off, and it's actually kind of a nightmare to get them off. So what you can do if you want to dry your herbs in an oven is you set it to its lowest temperature, like literally the lowest temperature that the oven will go at. Let it preheat for 30 minutes, and then you turn it off, and you leave the door open for like 5 minutes to let the bulk of that major heat kind of waft off. And then you put your herbs in the oven when it is a dry, low heat that is not going to fry your herbs or roast your herbs, since it's an oven. But because they tend to stick to roasting pan or baking sheets, what I recommend is you can use Teflon sheets, which are great. You can buy them for cheap on Amazon. You can also buy them really expensive for Amazon. So be real careful when you're shopping for them. Like, if you don't get scammed into buying really expensive Teflon sheets, because you can buy them for super cheap. They're just basically like Teflon paper, basically, and they're heat resistant. In fact, I don't know how heat resistant they are, so I wouldn't try using them in an oven that's like super, super high heat. I don't know how high heat they'll go. They may go really high heat, they may not. But at a low heat oven, it should absolutely be fine. In fact, I use them in my dehydrator all the time, and I find them really useful. And nothing will stick to them. They tend to peel off really easily. You can also use, and I've used this option as well. It's like a cooling rack, right? So you have like a cooling rack, and if you lay the herbs across the cooling rack and then you put the cooling rack in the oven, the herbs will dry kind of like on the rack. Now, they can still stick to the rack wherever they're in contact with them, but you're going to have far less stickage than you would in a baking sheet, because the baking sheet is like all surface, whereas the rack is, just like the occasional little bar. If you have heat-resistant metal screens, you can use that as well. I'd be careful about where you get them, because they may be made out of like not food-safe things. So like, I wouldn't go using a window screen, even though you're doing it in a really low-heat oven. Like, Lord knows what that window screen is made out of, especially if it's been sitting in your garage for 6 years. So if you want to go to the hardware store and you want to buy something metal that you can put your herbs on while they dry in the oven, just be real conscious about what it's made out of, how it responds to the heat, and make sure that it's food safe. I think that's about it. So yeah, like I said, the top factors that you want to not introduce to your herbs as they're drying are light, heat, so for very, very low heat if you have no other option, in a very low heat oven, and moisture. Once your herbs are dry, they'll dry usually pretty quickly depending on the environment. They might not need more than a couple days. You just want to make sure they're completely dry, right? Because if you take your herbs down or out before they're completely dry, and then you put them in a jar, what'll happen is they'll mold, right? And that's not good eats by any stretch of the imagination. So you want to make sure they're 100% dry. And you'll know that because when you touch a leaf and you go like this, it'll have zero give. It'll be like poof. It'll just break and crack, right? If there's any like bend at all, then it's not dry completely, and they will mold if you put them in a sealed jar. So once you have them all dried, you put them in a sealed jar. You want to make sure they're in a super, super highly sealed jar, because if you don't keep your dried herbs in a jar, what happens in a sealed container? What happens is all of the compounds, slowly evaporate, and they don't smell or taste good. Just like the herbs in your spice cabinet, right? They need to be sealed really tightly. And just like the herbs and spices in your spice cabinet, once your dried herbs are in a little jar and they're completely sealed, again, you need to keep them away from light, you need to keep them away from heat, and you need to keep them away from moisture. Those three things, right? I see so many people that have their herb and spice racks on the counter, and it's like sitting right next to the oven. So it's, whenever you're cooking, it's probably hitting, 100 degrees in that corner. And it's right across from a window. So the sun is like, bah! It's like the wrath of God on your spice rack. And like people, 3 years later, they go to open, they're like, these don't smell like anything. And that's just because you basically abused the hell out of them. You treated them like redheaded stepchildren. And they weren't happy, right? And exposing your dried herbs and spices to light, heat, and moisture will drastically reduce the amount of time that they are good for. Also, do not put your dried herbs in the fridge, because what can happen, I've seen people do this because they're like, oh, they'll last longer if I put them in the fridge. Well, they will, but what happens is when you remove them from the fridge at any point, like to use them, you will, the herbs and the inside of the jar and the outside of the jar, as they go from cold inside the fridge to warm outside of the fridge, will produce condensation, which will introduce moisture, which will eventually introduce mold, which is not good. So you can apply this technique to herbs that you grow. You can apply this technique to herbs that you buy from the grocery store if you have extra. I do got to warn you, if you wash your herbs first, you need to let them dry completely before attempting to dry them, because if you take like damp herbs and you tie them up with a string and you hang them in your garage, they will, like where where they're tied, the water won't evaporate or won't dry, and you'll end up with a moldy spot, and that's a bummer. You can dry little bits of herbs. You can dry whole huge amounts of herbs. Like if you have just like an extra sprig of like thyme that you bought from the grocery store and like you used half of it and you only have like 10 little branches, just tie a little string around them and hang them, and they'll dry just fine. You know, you can throw them in some soup. That's the other thing about some dried herbs too. If you generally you want to remove them from the stem, so like thyme or oregano or marjoram. When you put them in a jar, you want to remove the little leaves from the stem. But you can also leave them on the stem if you want to use them whole. So like if you're making like a soup, what you can do is you can take like, dried rosemary or dried thyme in the whole stem, wrap it up in cheesecloth with a couple of other things like some peppercorns, maybe some garlic, some cumin seeds, like depending on, what you're making, a bay leaf. Tie it in a little knot so it's like in a little parcel in cheesecloth, and then toss the whole thing in your soup or whatever moisture-based thing you're making, and then fish it out at the end. So now I've just rambled on for probably 10 minutes on dried herbs. Beth, I hope this answers your question. It may have produced like 50 more questions. If anybody has a question about drying your own herbs at home, go ahead and drop them below this video and I will get them answered. Have a good one, ninjas. Bye-bye.